I want to introduce Dr. Vince Ryan. He's a friend of mine. He teaches over at Aquinas College, history, and he did his MA and PhD in history at St. Louis University, where he specialized in revolutions of sorts and in the Crusades. So we're going to try to get him to come back in the spring and talk about the Crusades. And I think if I say it publicly enough, he'll have to come back.
Joan was just trying to shame me publicly to try to get me to come back. I'm relatively shameless, so it's not going to work. The picture, good evening, the picture on the slide behind me is a painting of one of the most famous episodes during the history of the entire Middle Ages. In the foreground, the man, and that's supposed to be sackcloth. That's the nicest, most flashy sackcloth anyone has ever worn in history. The Renaissance masters, even poverty, they just make look classy with their artistic skills. But the man in the foreground is the German Emperor Henry IV. And if you look back up at the top, above that little turret, behind, I guess, I don't know if that's a blue curtain there, you'll see someone arrayed in rather splendid red robes. That is Pope Gregory VII. Now, the painting commemorates a very famous moment in medieval church history, when in early January 1077, the German Emperor, Henry IV, appeared outside the walls of the castle of Canossa, which is up in the Alps of the mountain range up in northern Italy, standing outside in probably a less flashy sackcloth out there, barefoot, in a public act of atonement. It was snowing out, it was winter. His presence was surprising in part because the Pope, who was residing inside with some of his close associates, spending the Christmas season there, had excommunicated him some months before, so they weren't on good terms. And typically, the emperors don't just pop in on you with a relatively small entourage, standing outside in the cold for 3 days in a row. By the end of the third day, the Pope relented and lifted the excommunication ban on Henry IV. But the fact that the most powerful political leader in Europe would be out there, arrayed in the garment of a beggar, performing a public act of penance and contrition in such harsh conditions, was not only surprising by contemporary standards, but it reflects how far the clout of the papacy had come during the course of the 11th century. The topic of tonight's lecture, the religious revolution of the 11th century, old history trick, just gratuitously throw the word revolution in to make it seem flashier and more exciting. I'll try and justify it, but I'm just warning you. It was, like I said, I'm shameless. But it was revolutionary, I would argue, in part because of the way in which it reoriented the relationship between the ecclesiastical authority in the Middle Ages and political secular authorities in the period. I don't know if movie buffs out here, but one of the trendy things, it's almost cliche now that you see independent films used to do, particularly in the 90s, where they would do non-linear storytelling. So the movie would start usually with something that happened, and then they jump back like 5 days previously right there. So that's what I'm going to try to do right here. We're going to jump back 5 days previously, or in this case, I guess that would be, 700 years previously. So this is, I was thinking about this on the ride over. This is somewhat smug of me and almost irreverent that this map right here is supposed to sum up Christian history over a 600-year period. Okay? This is the most amazing map ever if it's able to successfully do that. What the map represents in those lovely different shades of orange is the expansion and growth of Christianity in the Roman world during the first 600 years of the existence of Christianity. So if you look at the dark orange pockets, you see it's different pockets of it there, and that represents the extent of Christianity right around 300. Now 300, or roughly thereabouts, was a major turning point in the history of Christianity, because it was about a decade and a half after that the Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which allowed Christianity to become an officially tolerated religion within the Roman Empire. Didn't make it the official religion, but allowed it to be legally practiced without the threat of persecution, which of course was quite the reversal change for the status of Christianity in the Roman Empire before that. And then when the emperor himself, Constantine, becomes Christian, that elevates even more the standing of Christianity as a big boost for the evangelizing efforts of the faithful there. And later that century, a later Roman emperor, Theodosius, makes Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire, which further boosts the expansion of Christianity. And in the centuries that follow, in the 5th century, in Western Europe, the political state known as the Western Roman Empire collapsed. And so this shockwave of and turbulence brought on in Western Europe by the collapse of political institutions that had provided a framework and a foundation and stability in that region since dating back to at least the 3rd century BC, if not earlier, really put that world into disarray. And the church was one of the few institutions in Western Europe that still remained somewhat stable. And because of that, when people are looking to, particularly they look to the church in times of crisis in particular, and this was a moment of great crisis in European history, that the profile and standing and status of the church grows all the more. It's filling the vacuum that's been left by the Roman Empire, not just religiously, that was its role, but in politically, socially, economically, its presence is growing, for better or for worse occasionally. But nonetheless, its presence is growing. One of the things that really helps sustain the church, helps grow the church during this era of transition, during particularly this era of political instability. I mean, that's the amazing thing. The church not only remains fairly stable, I mean, it has the occasional setback during this period, but it grows. It's able to emerge and really emerge stronger and emerge more vibrantly in the aftermath of the Roman Empire's collapse. And the big boost to the growth of the church in Western Europe are the efforts by the man pictured there, the dark robe and the red halo, St. Benedict of Nursia. Now, if we go back to that map there, what we see is just the beginning of a development that will soon explode during the course of the early Middle Ages. Those square boxes with little crosses, I guess. Do you see those up there? There's a lot of them there all around the place. Those aren't churches. Those are representing, as you can see on the key on the map, monastic communities. Now, monasticism as a way of life, as a vocation, as a communal existence, was first emerged in the Eastern Mediterranean. In Egypt is where it's traditionally thought to have come. But so it started there. It was slower in coming to the West. St. Benedict is the one who popularizes this during the course of the 7th century, right around the time, late 6th, early 7th century, right around the time that our map ends there. And so we see the beginnings of the blooming of Western monasticism in early medieval Europe. And why Benedict was so important? There had been, obviously, monastic communities well before Benedict's own involvement in monasticism. But was the rule that he formed for his community, and that was utilized by many other either pre-existing communities or new communities that we've emerged, the Benedictine rule. It was a rule. There's an Augustinian rule. There were other rules, some of them even less well known than Augustine's rule. But Benedict's one becomes the one that really has staying power, and the one that appeals because it's so detailed, but it also has an inherent pragmatism and flexibility to it. And so there's an adaptability towards it that made people really gravitate to it. And the level of detail in it also helped provide a blueprint to people trying to find a monastic community. And so Benedict's rule and the community he founds at Monte Cassino, there's modern Monte Cassino, picture there on the top right, The old medieval Monte Cassino was one of the casualties of World War II, bombed by the Allies, actually. The black monks, as they were known because of their habit, the Benedictines, become the most popular and most influential group in the church, perhaps, during the 7th and 8th centuries. And really, they're important for the preservation of ideas. I saw on the lecture series, you talked about the myths of the Dark Ages last week, so I imagine the speaker probably talked a lot about the role of monasticism in preserving and promoting learning and culture. It was the Benedictines who were primarily there. Benedict's mantra of orans et laborans, prayer and work together. Part of the laborans was about sustainability, because they were going out in these areas that were particularly all the more because of the breakdown of political order. They're all the more like on the frontier. That's been magnified, the boonies-ness of this. I mean, the boonies have exploded. Areas are going, many cultivated lands are lying fallow, populations depleting. So they, on their own, when they go out to these areas where there's not much of a population or a very small presence, they are, first and foremost, they're creating a community for purposes of prayer, contemplation, personal salvation. But they're also, in working these lands, helping, and this isn't the primary thing they're doing, but the process, they're building these lands up. They're acquiring these lands. It's not an Oklahoma land rush thing where everyone's running there and planting their flags. It's open territory that nobody wants, and they're taking it over. And after several generations, working it, building it up, the population of Western Europe is beginning to rebound a bit, and so communities are beginning to form around these monastic communities. Villages spring up or return again. And because of that, because of the explosion, when something becomes popular and becomes successful, it gets more people to want to emulate it. And I'm not trying to say monasticism was a fad, but when it's providing such a trailblazing role in some of these areas, and then becoming so economically integral to the region, this can sometimes lead to a slippery slope where problematic things can happen, particularly when you get very tied into the politics and economics of the area. And that wasn't the reason it happened. It just kind of accumulated over time. And so when that happens, then you begin to have some problems that emerge. The 9th century, you're beginning to see among a number of these monastic communities, particularly Benedictine ones because they're the dominant one there, you're beginning to see some issues, some problems where the great wealth that these communities have started to acquire because of their economic importance in these regions that's been built up over time, and because of that wealth that's there or their centrality to the community there, the local aristocratic families want to have more of a voice, more of a say, have their fingers all over what's going on in that monastic community because they see it as a potential rival or at least a place that they can use or an entity they can use to further enhance their own power. So then you have aristocratic families trying to meddle with these communities. And look, from their point of view, some of this is understandable because how do monastic communities get formed? Even if it's done by people who are taking vows of poverty, you got to have some money, you've got to have some to get the land and to form the early community. So often, monastic communities were able to come to existence through a donation, or sometimes it's called a benefice, by who? An aristocratic family. And so some of these aristocratic families, maybe 50, 70, 100 years later, would say, hey, my great-grandfather gave the money or provided the land for this. I feel that entitles me to something of our family, to a voice over who the abbot's going to be. Or I'm going to use that to leverage you into accepting my ne'er-do-well nephew who's still in the basement playing video games here, whatever the medieval equivalent is that, into your community right there. And probably video game playing nephew equivalent in the 9th century might not necessarily have a vocation. And so when these type of individuals begin being put in these communities, either as dumping grounds for younger family members or as ways to get their own people in there to over time have the inside man, if you will, to help influence the community. Well, this itself is going to snowball, unsurprisingly, into the communities not always being populated with people who are fully inspired by and embracing the rigors of the Benedictine rule. So you see the relaxation of the Benedictine rule where praying maybe a couple times a day, working, that's what servants are for. We'll hire them out there. So a lot of that, this becomes problematic. And it's not surprising because of the general trends that are here that these problems begin to permeate a number of monastic communities during the 9th and 10th centuries in Western Europe. The proprietary system is what I described, this idea that aristocratic families believed they had they had a right, an inherent right somehow, to have a say over the community. And so this involvement of the local political powers in monastic affairs was a big problem. From their point of view, they wouldn't see it, but from what was actually unfolding was one of the big contributors, not the sole one, but one of the big contributors to what was causing this problem not to improve, but to get worse. So it's into this context of the crisis of Western monasticism that we have the foundation of the most important, certainly most famous and celebrated monastic community in the Middle Ages, the monastery of Saints Peter and Paul in the city of Cluny. Often it's just called Cluny for short because it became so well known by that. And I think Cluny was both parts of it a casualty of the French Revolution. Those revolutionaries were just lovely people. They loved separating people from their heads, and when they couldn't guillotine someone, just destroying church property whenever they had some free time there. Very positive impact. It's for another day. Anyhow, I digress. So Cluny, World Wars and whatnot, this is just a sketch of what it looked like then. But at its height, you can see a pretty massive place. And the size of it there shouldn't be interpreted, and this isn't what it grew over time, but it grew to these proportions because it became so influential, so popular, a model that many began to emulate. Well, why was that? In the year 909, Duke William of Aquitaine provides the land and the money for the foundation of a new monastery here. The monastery becomes known as Cluny. But what he does in the Foundation Act is interesting, is that he revokes his right legally, and the rights that any later family members might try to claim they have to have any influence over the monastic community. So what's interesting, you can see in what he's doing to have this form, is he's underwhelmed by what's happened with some of monasticism. And so why would aristocratic families found monastic communities? Because what do monasteries do? They're praying, and they're working, but the idea is they're praying particularly for the dead. And so pray for them, pray for their loved ones, and pray for the living too, but particularly wanted people to pray for them when they were gone. And so William of Aquitaine seems to have thought, I'm not sure how effective the prayers of some of these monks currently are. I'm going to start a new one that hopefully will eliminate or we can more effectively safeguard against some of these problems. And so by revoking or relinquishing his right to Cluny, it allowed Cluny to emerge and develop independently without aristocratic interference, without ne'er-do-well nephews being dumped on them there, without someone leveraging to get their brother-in-law appointed the abbot and whatnot there. Oh, he can't read Latin? That's okay. So this is important. And Cluny will particularly emphasize the need for a recommitment to the Benedictine rule by Benedictine monasteries near and far, and will act as a model there, particularly emphasize the importance of the prayer life of the monastic community. I don't know, perhaps it came up in the lecture on the Dark Ages last week, but it becomes very important as well as a center for education and preservation of books and whatnot. But that develops over time. By the turn of the end of the 11th century, the monastery of Cluny has over 400 members in it, which would have been very large by that period there. So throughout the 11th century, you begin to see its influence grow, and it become this model of monastic reform. Really, maybe the better way to say monastic renewal, because it's not like they're changing anything. They're just saying, we need to get back to the basics. We need to recommit ourselves to this life of prayer and work. They benefit from having a number of abbots who are in power for a long period of time, so it provides stability of leadership, and these guys are very committed to the spirit of reform and renewal. And so their example, their influence, really begins to emanate throughout Western Europe. This map looks like some sort of weather map here, if you can see it, but that's what's being conveyed. The Cluny is there, if you can see it, the big orange there right there. And so what this image hopefully conveys is the way in which they're providing directly and indirectly a network of monastic reform. Directly in the sense that some of these pre-existing monastic communities say to them, hey, look, we want to do what you're doing, but we need some guidance. We need some leadership there. And can we connect ourselves as a sister house or a brother house to you? And the monks Cluny say, okay, sure. Or Cluny will help with using its influence to gain what are called exemptions from the papacy for the popes to grant monastic communities that might either exist or are going to be founded exemptions. That means legal documents that free them from the interference of both noble families, but interestingly also the bishop. So both groups are seen as, trying too much to use monastic communities as part of their power struggle there. So the example and influence of Cluny spawns this wider movement of monastic renewal and reform, particularly throughout, beginning in the late 10th, but really flourishing throughout the 11th century. So the religious revolution of the 11th century, the first major component of it is this reform and renewal of monasticism, centered at the monastery of Cluny, and these Cluniac houses that spring up or reform throughout Western Europe in particular. Now, the crisis of Western monasticism is just one of several what we might call big picture problems that Europe is facing during the 9th and 10th centuries. Another one it's facing is a crisis of political order once again. Sounds familiar. We've talked about it with the Roman Empire's breakdown back in the 4th century. Well, in the 8th and early 9th century, a very influential family become very central to the narrative of the Middle Ages, the Carolingian family, or the Carolingian dynasty, whose most famous member was Charlemagne, the great ruler and conqueror, Charles the Great. There, through Charlemagne's efforts in conquest, he was almost constantly at war and very successful, but also he was smart about governance and being innovative administratively. He forged a large state, sometimes called the Carolingian Empire, up in the northwestern part of Europe. So parts of northern Italy, modern-day France, Germany, parts of Central Europe, all there. It was a very large state that the Carolingians had constructed. And this empire was really the first return of a major geopolitical state in Western Europe since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, some 4 centuries or so before. Unfortunately, though, the Carolingian Empire, historically speaking, just had a brief moment in the sun. After Charlemagne's own death, the Carolingians, by the way, they've got these great nicknames. So, again, Charlemagne, he's the best because Charles the Great is his name. Anytime someone gets the Great, usually means they did something there. It's not the most creative nickname, but it's easy, kind of history for dummies. His dad was called Pepin the Short. Probably we can figure that one out. His son who succeeded him, Louis the Pious. Seems like he's bragging about his holiness a little bit, but they have these names. And a grandson was named Charles the Bald. I've increasingly become more sympathetic for Charles right there, these nicknames. More sympathetic than I want to be. But Charles the Bald and his brothers, they fought over their inheritance. Sibling rivalry in this generation of the family found a very bad manifestation in civil war erupting, causing the breakdown of the empire internally into separate kingdoms. And this happens right around the time, look at the map there, all these different lines represent this new wave of invasions that are happening in Western Europe. So those red lines there, going from Eastern Europe, a group that caused a lot of havoc. They're not as well known or remembered now. The Magyars, someone Charlemagne was dealing with a lot in his time, are wreaking havoc and invading in Eastern and Central Europe. To the south, down in Spain, you see there, the blue lines represent Muslim invasions coming from Spain into different parts of Italy and southern France. And then all those cursed orange lines all over the place represent the most iconic troublemakers of the Middle Ages, famous for helmets they probably never wore, though their grooming was as bad as we probably have there, and the level of chaos and destruction that they inflicted was indeed disastrous. The Vikings, Viking invasions too. So the split up of the Carolingian Empire into different sub-kingdoms, separate kingdoms, had, through internal fighting, had broken up this large state that the Carolingians had forged. And now these different kingdoms, besides fighting each other, are also very susceptible to invasions. It's overrunning these kingdoms. One of the brothers' kingdoms will implode within a decade because of these invasions. So we're getting a sense of a real crisis of political governance once more that's emerging. And just like the last era of a great crisis of governance that Western Europe was facing back in the 5th century in the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, in the same sense, people look to the church for guidance, for support, as the beacon throughout this crisis there. The church very effectively filled this role during the 5th and 6th centuries. But in the 9th and 10th centuries, particularly the 10th century, which we're seeing up here, the crisis of Western monasticism had exposed people to the fact that not all was well in some of these monastic communities. And another crisis that we'll look at in a moment further magnified that there were problems within the church, within church leadership, that the spotlight was being shined on a little bit more closely in this time of political chaos as people looked, the average person looked to the church all the more for leadership and for example, and in many cases found it wanting. A grassroots movement that emerged during the end of the 10th century and became very popular during the first half of the 11th century. A movement that reflects one of the other manifestations of this revolution, religious revolution of the 11th century, is called the Peace of God movement. Because you're normal human beings, you probably haven't heard it before, but people who study medieval history or are nerdy about this is like a really big thing that they get into and argue because it seems it's both trendy and it's got this populist component. So people in academics and apparently in politics love populism. Again, it's making a comeback for some reason. But the Peace of God movements reflect this grassroots effort of wanting the church to step up and provide leadership and try and respond to the violence and chaos that's there in parts of Western Europe, particularly France is where you're seeing it. Now, medievalists like this because, they get all agog about, a pacifist movement, this is, wonderful. But the Peace of God movement is more than just pacifism. At least that's the argument I'm going to make here this evening. First and foremost, obviously it's named the Peace of God movement. Yes, clearly, a peace element, right? They weren't trying to trick anybody here. The first gathering these, really they sometimes called them peace councils. I don't want you to get the sense that these made them official councils of the church, but it's like trying to give the sense of local city council gatherings there because there was a civic component to it, even if it was usually a religious figure who was initiating it or providing leadership of it. The first of these met in 975 in the city of Le Puy, beautiful city to visit someday, by the way. The Bishop Guy of Le Puy gathered there a number of members of local aristocratic families and also maybe peasants or townspeople who are known to be involved in fighting and violent activity from time to time. And he gathered this large gathering of those people as well as many people from the community gathered there in a field outside the city of Le Puy, where he announced that anybody who was going to continue doing things like pillaging churches, attacking the clergy, robbing the poor, attacking women and children and the elderly, that was going to stop. And if they didn't, they were going to be excommunicated immediately, right there. And if that threat of excommunication didn't get their attention, Bishop Guy signaled to his nephew there, who had an army with him, that the nephew would deal with anybody who had a problem with what's going on. Now, this is interesting tactic, encourage peace through the threat of violence right there, but sometimes you got to get the conversation, the ball rolling with the cracking a few eggs in the process. What's interesting here is this. Now, this is the first example of it, and this really catches on. It's obviously successful, so others are inspired in other places, particularly in France and some parts of Germany, to do similar things, and it's happening on the local level. There's no directives coming from above saying this. This is a grassroots effort of rallying around the local church, looking at the local church for leadership, and wanting, and the church has an interest in this too, particularly about protecting the faithful, protecting their own property as well, and use this as a means to try and bring some sense of stability and order once more. So these peace councils really begin to catch on, and we know of at least 22 that happened during the course, mostly in the early 11th century, particularly in parts of France. As these peace councils become more common, it's interesting that one of the things that starts to happen is that besides just being about what's sometimes called a war on war, is what they're doing, is that they begin to think, look, part of this is about good behavior. And about good behavior means stop being involved in violence and assaulting people and whatnot. But these peace councils begin to broaden the scope of their focus. They're still first and foremost, it's called the Peace of God movement. They're interested in peace. But they begin to be interested in bigger questions about appropriate behavior for both laity and clergy. And one of the issues that comes up a lot, this is interesting, in these peace councils, particularly in the 11th century, well, one of many, but one of the ones that recurs the most, is the need for celibacy amongst the clergy. And this is often, interestingly, the laity saying this. Sometimes the bishops as well are doing it, but some of the laity are saying, like, look, and why are they saying that? Well, in part, they feel the quality of the priests they have are not that great. In part because the worldliness attached, the temptations of worldliness attached to some of these positions lead to people who might not necessarily have the right intentions in there. But also, when clerical concubinage becomes more problematic and more pervasive, you have priests trying to create like dynasties over parishes, passing on the parish to their son there. And so this really begins to be problematic about effective spiritual leadership for the faithful. So that's why you see the faithful being like, we want a better quality of priest than what we're getting there. So you have a spirit of reform. Certainly social reform, I think, is the bigger threat here. But there's a religious reforming component that's very clearly present in the Peace of God movement that is animating it and showing that the faithful are encouraged by reform and that there's a collaboration between laity and ecclesiastical authority, often with these peace councils, to address and try and improve and ameliorate the situation and problems that they're facing on the local level. One of the reasons this tended to be more local in nature when these Peace of God movement first emerged in the late 10th, early 11th century is besides there being a crisis in Western monasticism, a crisis that was now at this time starting to be more effectively addressed, there was also what we might say a crisis of the papacy. Since at least the 9th century, you begin to see increasingly a number of individuals of less than ideal moral character, it's a very charitable way of putting it, increasingly occupying the throne of St. Peter. Why is this happening? Well, in the same way where the crisis of monasticism was in part something that developed out of the growth of monastic communities' involvement in the economic and political sphere and how that attracted more people and caused problems that we've already gone over here. One of the things the Carolingians did was Charlemagne, first his dad, Pepin the Short, and then he as well, they took armies down to northern Europe a few different times during the 8th century because the popes were being harassed by these groups of barbarian invaders called the Lombards. And so the Carolingians acted as the muscle for the papacy, where they'd come down, and when the Lombards were trying to take the church's lunch money, Charlemagne would come in there and crush the Lombards. And then after doing this a few times, first his dad and then him, they realized, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to give you these lands in the center of Italy that the Lombards took, and we're going to give them to you guys. They're yours. We don't want them. Our stuff is up here. you use this to generate revenue to protect yourselves, to be able to raise up an army, so you can be better self-sustaining that way, and so we don't have to come down here all the time when there's a problem. So this donation of Pepin, it's called, and then later Charlemagne will augment it with his conquest, forms the basis of what becomes known as the Papal States. So in the 8th century, the popes go from being the spiritual leader of the Catholic Church, which they still remain, to being also territorial princes of this section of central Italy. That's how it develops, out of really protecting themselves at first. But the best laid plans. Okay? It's understandable how this came about. And frankly, the case can be made very necessary. But as the Papal State grows in significance and influence there, it causes the papacy to get more and more embroiled in local political matters, which becomes a problem from time to time. It becomes a problem on the eve of the Reformation, too. It's no surprising that these two things parallel each other in this way. And this means that you have Roman politics make our political dynamic seem very, mild and charitable and loving. Roman politics, whether it be ancient Rome or medieval Rome, nasty, brutal stuff. Really, really cutthroat. Literally, they're cutting people's throats doing there. But it's, and the turmoil that this causes of Roman noble families they see the papacy as something that can boost their clout, their status, their influence and power in Rome and in the territory around it, the Papal States. So there's a rivalry among a lot of prominent Roman noble families to control the papacy. Because remember, for them, the Pope isn't just the leader of the Catholic Church, he also is what? The Bishop of Rome, the local bishop. So that further elevates the significance of that office to local Roman politics. And this leads to less than ideal people being put on there, being put on the throne of St. Peter by whatever powerful Roman noble family could. Which also leads, by the way, to a high turnover. Between 955 and 1049, Dan, you want to check those dates? I might have made them up. There's 23 people who serve as pope. And this isn't because they're all, saying the prayer to St. Joseph, dying peaceful deaths in their bed there, surrounded by loved ones. They're either being kicked out, deposed, murdered. Sometimes they just get bored with it and quit. And this high turnover adds to, weak leadership, scandal, and the papacy doesn't, it's not that interested in reform because, frankly, it's embroiled so much in political matters. There's a lot of juicy examples to choose from to highlight this, but I'll go with a particularly notorious one. Pope John the 12th. Now, some of the problems is the sourcing is very mediocre for the 9th century, and we get it from sources well outside of Rome, so who knows how much they're playing a game of like medieval telephone, or they're snowballing a story, or they're just being really, they're employing a rhetorical device of really making something super extreme to get the point across to their audience. So we always need to have a little bit of skepticism with how accurate all the details are. But I think it represents a truth that there was a lot of corruption and terrible leadership in the papacy. So maybe some of the specific stories are more fiction than fact. But apparently, John the 12th was only 16 years old when he became pope. It wasn't because he was a prodigy when it became matters of Latin or liturgy or theology. Okay? It's a vivid example of the problem here. His grandmother was this fascinating gal that doesn't get enough attention. This female godfather of medieval Rome during the 10th century. And so she put one of her sons as pope, and then when he gets bumped off, decides, make this grandson as just 16 pope. Well, as a 16-year-old and someone who'd grown up in this other era of corruption and licentiousness and Roman aristocratic family, Pope John the 12th is not that interested in theological matters, more interested in meeting women, showing them the papal palace, maybe sampling the vineyards, what they produce there. It's a nice way of saying he was a drunkard. And he's a particularly extreme example of how bad things got, but one of many. And this, as these stories begin to circulate more, the scandal it causes, and the person who should be at the wheel here of the ship, as the church is trying to navigate another period of of political chaos and an era where there's some need for, let's say, some renewal and reform. It's not happening. They're failing to seize the moment, seize that responsibility. And this situation leads, look, it's not all bad. Someone like Pope Sylvester II, sometimes he's called the Millennium Pope, because he was the one who was a pope in 1000. He represents someone, he's the first Frenchman apparently to become pope. And he was a man noted for his learning. He was only pope for 4 years, so his efforts to start a reforming agenda didn't really gain much traction, because after he died, then one of these Roman family flunkies gets thrown on there, and so everything goes back to the status quo. And that was the problem. Even when you have occasionally someone as impressive as Sylvester II. This is a great book, by the way, The Abacus on the Cross. It does a few dopey things about Dark Ages stereotypes, but really great read if you're looking for something to better educate yourself about medieval history, but also about the church. Talks about the church's role. This guy was one of the most famous intellects of the age. He became pope. He's credited with inventing the abacus. But his efforts, there weren't enough of these guys. That's the problem. The light burned, but it burned briefly, and then it was out, and then, you had, I don't know where this metaphor is going, a strobe light, I guess, come in there. It's parting. It's bad. Sorry, it's spontaneous metaphors. I'm not good at that. So the German emperors, who would see themselves as the successors of Charlemagne, in the sense that that title, Holy Roman Emperor, which was first given to Charlemagne, another famous moment in the Middle Ages, on Christmas Day 800, when Charlemagne is down in Rome visiting the Pope after helping him with the Lombards yet again. The Pope, in his gratitude, goes up to him while he's praying after Mass, and it's a spontaneous crowning ceremony where he gives him this title, Holy Roman Emperor, that's there. Charlemagne didn't really make much of the title, it seems, in his own official decrees, but his successors really played it up. And then when the Carolingian line dies out, this line of German emperors takes up the title and sees themselves, and they're crowned Holy Roman Emperors after that. And so as Holy Roman Emperors, they feel that title gives them a certain level of not just right, but a responsibility to look at a situation like what's happening with the papacy in the 10th and 11th centuries and go address it. So in the 10th century, you have a few of these guys, Otto I, Otto III, sometimes known as Otto the Great, Henry II, and Henry III in particular. All of them go down to Rome at some point, usually with an army, because it helps kind of make sure everyone goes along with what you're going to do. Depose the corrupt, scandalous person who's acting as pope there, usually a member of the local Roman family, and put one of their own people on there. Now, good intentions, but sort of doing the same thing that, even though they're putting someone better, is part of why the problem's happening here, of just politics dictating appointment. But for them, they feel like they're involved in reform in some way. They're trying to improve things. Henry III, during a 3-year period, again, life expectancy for popes wasn't great. Not all of it was because of violence, just, Middle Ages, healthcare, not high end. He goes down there and puts a number of German bishops, nominates them as the pope. And so these guys keep going down across the Alps down there, and then they die maybe 9 months later, so they're not gaining any momentum here. Okay, they're actually people of much better quality, who are educated, who are wanting to start the process, but they're not gaining much traction. The first pope that Henry III deposes is another very notorious one in this era named Benedict IX. And when he gets deposed, he somewhat sheepishly goes up to Henry III. He doesn't object. He just asks him if he can have the bribe money back that he used 8 years before to get the position. So Henry tells him to get lost. But it kind of highlights again, this needs to happen. So after a few of these guys have died off, Henry decides to choose an extended kinsman of his, Bruno of Toul, who's a bishop and very renowned for his as a theologian up in the German Empire, decides to nominate him as the new pope. So Bruno of Toul travels down to Rome with his circle of clerical followers who are interested in ideas of reform and who he invites to come with him down there. And when he arrives, he won't enter the city of Rome until he's invited by the people of Rome to come in, because he doesn't want his nomination to appear like it's, simony is involved, because he's loosely related to the emperor. So he was keen to try and, it's a way to get the acceptance of the Roman people, if not the Roman aristocratic families. He's smart that way. He takes the name Leo IX and becomes one of the most important popes of the Middle Ages in not just the reforming agenda that he will initiate during his 5 years as pope, and it might not seem like a lot, but during the last century, 5 years is like an eternity as pope, is the way they're dropping like flies. But it's not just that. What gives also momentum to his reforming efforts is he brings with him a circle of reformers up from Germany. And when he gets to Rome, he invites people of a celebrated reputation for their personal holiness or their theological insights to come to Rome, to come help assist him in implementing first a reform of the papacy, but then a wider reform of the church itself. So he's trying to start a movement that can last beyond him, because obviously the circle of reformers can assist him in his reforming agenda, but also hopefully they become a pool from which future popes begin to come from, as opposed to 16-year-old ne'er-do-wells, who from some Roman aristocratic family. And unsurprisingly, considering what we've looked at so far this evening, a large number of these reformers are people of what type of background? Monastic background, as the spirit of reform has already been alive and well in monasticism during the second half of the 10th and the first half of the 11th century, by the time Leo becomes pope. So Cluny, or its network of Cluniac houses, bring a lot of people. A lot of people come from that background, so they're very well versed in reform rhetoric and reform ideas and the theology that supports that. Monte Cassino, fittingly, it's nearby. It's in the heart of Italy there. Its association with St. Benedict made it one of the few places where the rule of St. Benedict, for the most part, continued to be rigorously embraced, even throughout the era where many were becoming relaxed in that. And several abbots of Monte Cassino will be people over the next 30 years that become important in the reform movement, and a few of them actually become pope after this era. So these monastic communities are being very significant in helping give real traction and staying part of this movement. Famous theologians like St. Peter Damian, a saint who's not that well known anymore, one of the most celebrated theological minds of the 11th century. If Bernard of Clairvaux was the great theologian of the 12th century, Peter Damian was the great celebrated theologian of the 11th century. So he is invited, and he was mostly lived as a hermit for a while, but Leo is able to convince him to come participate in this. And one of Leo's acolytes is a Cluniac monk named Hildebrand, who comes down with him in Germany. He was, even by reforming standards, pretty hardcore about reform, really excited about it, and to the point where even some of the other reformers feel like, just calm down, Hildebrand there. So he's going to figure again in our story here in a moment. So these guys are able to gain some traction here. We see what does Leo do is he makes a number of these reformers that come with him and come to Rome, he makes them into cardinals. Now, the position of cardinal had existed for quite some time, but its roles previously have been primarily, it was about Roman issues, it was a Roman position, and it was primarily about liturgy. So now what he's doing is he's elevating the cardinals to being, not just a Roman ecclesiastical position, a European ecclesiastical position, and for them to be very involved in governance and administration and theological matters as well. And this heightens the status of these reformers, give them more credibility on a wider European stage, and this is very important. Leo's time in the reform movement is short-lived, relatively speaking, but the agenda that he initiates will be taken up by his successors, many of whom had come down to Rome with him when he first became pope. And under Leo and the first several reform popes, they're primarily interested, their reform activity is primarily twofold. It's about issues that relate to trying to crack down on the worldliness and corruption of the clergy. So the two things they target are eliminating simony, which is the buying and selling of church offices, a problem that comes up from time to time in the history of the church. Certainly it had come up in centuries earlier, comes up again during the eve of the Reformation. And I think we've already got a sense why people would buy these positions. The power and revenue associated with them is very tempting. And it leads to very problematic people coming to these positions. That's one of the main planks of reform. The other is making clerical celibacy the norm. Celibacy hadn't been the ideal since the early church for the clergy, but if you weren't a bishop, you were allowed to be married. And if you were married, you could become a bishop, but you were expected to live a chaste lifestyle with your wife at that. But still, the idea was it's the ideal that the clergy in particular, the faithful, should strive for, certainly as Paul's ideas in the Pauline letters, but the clergy in particular. You see even the laity wanting this to be more the norm, and the church realizing that celibacy needs to be the norm because it's the concubinage, the scandal of it, but also the people who are gaining these positions, it's very problematic. So the reforming efforts of Leo IX and his early successors primarily are focused on this. And in spite of all these great minds and the power of the papacy fully mobilized behind it, they're having trouble gaining some traction. And they begin to realize, some later Reformed popes, that part of the thing that's really impeding their efforts here is that this issue of secular political authority interference in appointments to church positions, where kings, emperors, noble families are using their clout to nominate bishops or abbots, because these are important positions. They want someone that's connected to them in them. And this is leading to people who aren't necessarily ideal to promoting reform or even representing reform. They're often getting their position because they bought it. They represent the problem. They're not part of the solution. And so while this third one comes later, they realize that for 1 and 2 to be effectively addressed, number 3 has to be part of the package. You have to eliminate this practice, particularly as the key thing, it's called lay investiture. That's the technical term for the appointment of these people to ecclesiastical positions by secular authorities. Now, this is the real hot button issue, because the emperors, they feel like they reflect the spirit of reform. After all, Henry III's efforts had started, probably unintentionally, the Reformed papacy by his nomination of his kinsman as pope. And the aristocracy, they didn't want people who were monks who weren't saying the divine office, in their monasteries that they had given money for, because they feel like their prayers aren't very good, and they're not the type of monks that they want praying for them there. So they support reform. But this is the issue that becomes very volatile, because now they see it as undermining their political position there. And it's an issue that's really taken up, particularly after Leo's death, by the popes that follow him there. Many of them come from that circle of reformers. One of the first major steps they do to show their commitment to this is under Pope Nicholas II, a synod in Rome that occurs there in 1058 and 1059 passes what's called the Papal Election Decree of 1059, which brings to an end this practice of an emperor or aristocratic family nominating and appointing pope, and says only the cardinals choose who the next pope is going to be. So this is all developing out of this reform in their way to say, okay, this is how we're keeping the secular authorities from interfering in matters at the very top of the position. And this sets the gold standard, if you will, for later developments that are here. When Gregory VII becomes pope in 1073, the man who we began this lecture with, who was there with the German emperor standing outside his castle in early 1077, Gregory VII is Hildebrand. He finally gets his chance to be pope, and he's the really hardcore reformer, and he's the one who's been talking about lay investiture being the big issue that's at the core of all this. He pursues this with a passion. And he has the type of fiery personality, but also great theological mind, that's willing to have this battle with the major political powers of Europe. And none is greater than the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry IV. At first glance, that medieval manuscript illustration might look like they're being very friendly. Hey, we're holding each other's stuff. But the point being is that Henry's trying to grab, if you see there, at what? At Gregory's staff, which the illustration is representing. He's interfering, the symbolism is, with ecclesiastical matters. And Gregory says to him, just because you're the emperor doesn't give you any right to have a say in ecclesiastical appointments. You're a layman. You're a very powerful layman, but guess what? You're just a layman, and you have the same level of influence and right to nominate bishops as Odo the peasant has, which is none. Okay. Now, Henry doesn't particularly like that. The letters they send back and forth are amazing examples of passive aggressiveness, which then after a while gets cast aside, and it's medieval insults are going back and forth. It's not the model of charity, but it's kind of funny. And this culminates in Gregory excommunicating Henry in 1076, which puts Henry in a very bad position. It causes people in his empire, it makes their oaths of loyalty no longer valid. So civil war is potential. That's why he's down there begging for forgiveness. And when Gregory lifts the excommunication bull, Henry recants, takes an army down, chases Gregory out of Rome, tries to put his own person on the throne there, an anti-pope named Clement III. So Gregory makes investiture the big focus of the reform movement during his pontificate, and it will become an issue after. Even if he dies in 1085 with his rival having the upper hand, his successors will succeed in bringing out the agenda and the fruits of the reform movement to being fully realized by the end of the 11th, the early 12th century. And the wider 11th century reform movement, which is sometimes sloppily called Gregorian reform. Gregory was just one of the last popes here. He didn't start it. He's building upon a monastic reform movement, the peace of God movement, the movement of papal reform that began with Leo IX. He has a big impact on it here. But what it represents very vividly is the fact that in many periods during its history, the church is in need or experiencing reform or in need of reform. Now, reform in different ways. It can be small reform, sometimes big picture reform. The famous 20th century Christian theologian Karl Barth is often credited with this statement, Ecclesia semper reformanda. The church is always reforming, or I think really it should be translated, always in need of reform. It's a little bit of a Calvinist idea there, but I think we'd say there's a Catholic principle buried in here. If we change the adverb semper to saepe, I'm just gratuitously showing off my Latin here. It's just wasted too much of my life learning Latin, so you're going to pay for it just for a couple minutes. To the church, saepe often is in need of reform. If you study the history of the church, that's a truism. And it's not necessarily a condemnation of the church, it's a reflection of it's filled with people who have the stain of original sin on them, like all people, and even those trying to do their best make mistakes there, but particularly in the pre-modern period, the church's involvement so much in the political sphere could often accelerate these problems or make these temptations more frequent. So we have big movements of reform, like in the 16th and 17th centuries, the Counter-Reformation, the response to the Reformation, the Council of Trent, pictured there. That's a major reform movement in the church that will happen again later on. I mean, these things continue to happen. Or a more recent and smaller, but still significant type of reform. With Joseph Ratzinger, who was a cardinal, talked about the need, what he'd call the reform of the reform, the idea of the post-Vatican II liturgy still needing some renewal and reform to it. And so, a few years back, I remember when certain refrains in the Mass were tweaked, or lines in the Creed. That was a reflection of the implementation of this idea of the reform of liturgy. So reform takes many manifestations within the history of the church. Sometimes it's very dramatic stuff, like the reform movement of the 11th century. Some would say, Pope Francis talks a lot about reform. Obviously, early on this got connected to the Vatican Bank, but I think his idea of reform to be determined still, but clearly something he associates himself with, and others connect to him. And so this idea of reform and renewal remains very close to the identity of the church, and it's not always a sign of failure. Sometimes it is, but it's a big one there, the need to do some pruning of the branches, if you will. But it's a reflection there of, I think, the 11th century reform movement shows how this is part of the narrative of the church and will remain that there of reform, large and small. The reform of the 11th century left an indelible mark for the better on the Catholic Church. But I want to say one more thing before we call it an evening. The Concordat of Worms in 1122 finally solidified the German emperor's, Henry IV's son, Henry V, begrudging acceptance that he could no longer appoint bishops and abbots. The Pope at the time, Calixtus II, and he had come to this agreement called the Concordat of Worms, which shows, if Gregory in his own lifetime didn't triumph, the reform movement ultimately triumphed in its efforts. Problems would still come up from time to time with people trying to choose bishops and priests. The French Revolution tried to force priests to take oaths of loyalty to the French Revolution. This still could come up from time to time. But the principle was fully grounded here of this need for, and I think this is something where there's a contemporary element to the culmination of the 11th century Reform movement, is this. That really the ideal of religious liberty, in some sense, religious freedom, is present in the 11th century Reform movement. Maybe not right away, but what you see there is the 11th century Reform movement and the Reformers, what they do is they clarify the nature of the relationship between the church and the state. Now, their concept of church and state or separation of things, they would, see ours as somewhat foreign to them. But they'd see the interference, what they'd use the word pollution of the church through lay appointments, lay investiture, as something that would need to be addressed. Because for them, the church and the state must be separate if the church is going to enjoy the liberty it needs, the freedom it needs to effectively carry out its mission. That's why lay investiture became the third plank of the Reform agenda. And so religious liberty is still something that's a big issue nowadays for the church, a major potential crisis confronting the church in the modern age. It's manifests itself a little bit differently, but images like this one here remind us of the need to be cognizant of this, to recognize that this principle was firmly grounded in a revolutionary way during the Reform movement of the 11th century. And so the church's continuing commitment to it, even in a slightly different manifestation, represents a continuation of something that was first really laid out, the culmination of the 11th century Reform movement. Thank you for your time this evening.